Hi, I'm Nina Melendez, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, a show about the world of work and our place in it. Today, we're talking about the war in Ukraine. Russian troops are continuing their efforts to take the city of Mykolaiv, a key location for control of the entire Black Sea coast. More than 1.5 million people are fleeing Ukraine in just the 10 days since the war began, creating Europe's biggest refugee crisis since World War II. Meanwhile, Ukraine has turned to the International Court of Justice at The Hague for help, according to the New York Times, claiming that Russia is committing genocidal acts. We're going to discuss the macroeconomic effects of this, but first, let's talk about the humanitarian crisis. I want to bring in my next guest, Kate MacKintosh. She is the executive director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA Law School. She has held multiple roles at international criminal tribunals, including working as a lawyer with judges. Kate, welcome to the show.
Hi, Nina. Glad to be here.
Thanks for being here. Kate, so like I said, more than 1.5 million people have already evacuated, and Ukraine is a country of 44 million people. My question is, what are the legal obligations for the neighboring countries to shelter some of these refugees, if there are any?
There absolutely are. Under international law, no one can be returned to a situation where their life is at risk. And this is guaranteed by a combination of international laws, including international human rights law, international refugee law, and regional arrangements. So, for example, within the Council of Europe, which provide that persons fleeing armed conflict must receive what's known as international protection.
And there are reports that some non-Ukrainian nationals are being prevented from fleeing the country, being treated like third-class citizens. So this would be criminal then as well. How is this enforced in the middle of a war?
It's not actually a crime, but it is a violation of international law. So international law requires that human rights be respected in a non-discriminatory fashion. In fact, non-discrimination is one of the core principles of international human rights law, and you will have seen the High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism, various UN officials have spoken out about this discriminatory treatment. Now, how it can be enforced in the middle of crisis is another matter. Generally, international law is enforced sometimes through international courts, but more often through international pressure. Most states do not want to present themselves as breaking international law.
And a prosecutor for the International Criminal Court is fast-tracking an investigation, if possible, war crimes in the Ukraine. And this was after 39 countries requested they do so. Have we ever seen anything like this before, or is this kind of unprecedented?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So now we are talking about criminal law. We're talking about the actual war crimes, and war crimes mean the deliberate targeting of civilians, of civilian objects, by which I mean schools, hospitals, museums, and so on. This kind of action, which is actually an international crime. And so the International Criminal Court in The Hague does have jurisdiction over this. What's really exceptional here is this referral from the 39 countries that we have not seen before. And what that means for the prosecutor is that he can straight away go to start his investigation. If they had not referred it, the prosecutor would have had to ask for permission from the judges of the court to start his investigation. But with this concerted action from the other states, he can proceed immediately.
And do you think that Putin could be tried for war crimes for the invasion into Ukraine?
Well, there are two things here. There are actually two different crimes. The war crimes we've discussed, the invasion itself is also a crime, an international crime. It's the international crime of aggression. Now, whether Putin can be tried at the International Criminal Court, he could certainly be tried for the war crimes. The International Criminal Court actually couldn't try him for the crime of aggression, and that's because Ukraine and Russia have not signed up to be part of that system whereby they would give the court authority over the crime of aggression. It would be possible for Putin and others who might be responsible to be investigated and prosecuted for the crime of aggression, interestingly, by other states who'd already incorporated the crime of aggression as an international crime into their own laws. And we've seen war crimes being prosecuted, for example, by Germany, for war crimes committed in Syria, prosecuted in Germany. And this system of universal jurisdiction backs up efforts that can be undertaken at the International Criminal Court and spreads the opportunities for accountability more widely.
How long does that accountability take usually?
Well, unfortunately, it's a pretty slow moving situation, as you can imagine. And that's why I say, in terms of actually stopping things that are happening now, including discriminatory treatment of refugees, really it's more important the pressure from states than the actually what's going to happen in court. Because of course, the International Criminal Court prosecutor or any national prosecutor is going to have to do a really thorough investigation, abide by standards of due process, make sure they have all the evidence lined up. And frankly, we can anticipate that would take a number of years.
Kate, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us and for making time for us today.
Welcome, Nina.
That's Kate MacKintosh. She's the Executive Director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA Law. I want to bring in my next guest, Ed Yardeni. Ed is president of Yardeni Research and author of Dr. Ed's blog. He is one of the most respected economists and investment strategists on the street. He's an alumnus of Cornell University and got his PhD from Yale in economics. Ed, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much.
It's great to have you. Ed, Russia has been trying to sanction-proof its economy for years now. My two questions for you is, how sustainable is this? How long can they continue sanctioning-proofing their economy? And two, will this immiseration of Russia just turn it into another North Korea?
Well, I think it's very important to recognize that the sanctions have had a very immediate impact on the Russian economy. The ruble has collapsed, which means that their inflation rate is going to accelerate, means that their interest rates are going higher. As a matter of fact, the central bank doubled the official interest rate almost immediately when the sanctions were imposed to try to keep the ruble from totally collapsing, but it happened anyways. Their stock market is basically shut down. And the economic impact, I think, is going to be quite severe. Now, of course, much will depend on whether the West does or does not cut off purchasing oil and gas from Russia, because that's still going to provide them with revenues. But clearly, the sanctions and the world reaction have made Russia a pariah state, and I think that matters.
And is these sanctions really going to impact the leadership in Russia, or is it impacting Russians?
It's impacting Russians. Clearly, some of Putin's cronies, some of the oligarchs have been hard hit, but I'm sure they've still got plenty of resources. So the reality is, you're right, it's mostly hitting average Russians, but to the extent that that gets them riled up and gets more of them to turn against the government, that would be helpful. But it's very hard to predict. I mean, the reality is this is a kleptocracy. It's a tyranny. It's a state that clearly has a tremendous amount of control of its population with secret police. And so I think the immediate impact of the sanctions isn't going to be shown in Russia's willingness to back off. Quite the opposite. For now, they may be trying to accelerate what they're doing with even more violence. So it's horrible.
You know, Ed, you recently wrote that China has a huge incentive to disrupt or to have Russia stop its invasion of Ukraine. Can you explain why?
Well, the Chinese clearly depend very much on the global economy. And the reality is that the surge in commodity prices is depressing global economic activity. Europe could very well fall into a recession here as a result of soaring oil and gas prices. The U.S. economy is slowing down. A shortage of grain could create some real instability in parts of the world. Remember, the Arab Spring was associated with the soaring food prices. The Chinese need stability. They want the global economy to grow. They need the global economy more than ever because their domestic situation is terrible. They've got a property bubble that just blew up, and because of their one-child policy, their domestic consumption is extremely weak.
And the West is a huge a purchaser of their exports. So they want to make sure.
I mean, the only good thing that might come out of this, hopefully, it will be a change of regimes in Russia. But I think the Chinese are going to have to seriously reconsider whatever plans they might have had to attack Taiwan. I think one thing that's come out of this is the world just stood up and made Russia a pariah state. The world could do the same thing to China if it were to invade Taiwan. So if China wants stability, they've got to do something in Russia and convince Putin that he's got to stop.
Yeah, it's a good example. China should be looking at Putin's actions as an example of what might happen if China decided to invade Taiwan. Right. One thing, a separate note, one thing that the war has been doing is completely disrupting freight. And Maersk and other major container lines have stopped their cargo shipments or intercontinental rail bookings from Asia to Europe. What are the ripple effects of this on the global economy, and will they be significant?
Well, I think the most immediate impact is clearly visible in soaring commodity prices. We've seen agricultural prices going up, led by grain prices. Odessa is a major exporting center for Ukrainian wheat, and so that's not getting out. And then the sanctions have had an impact on how difficult it is to get oil and gas out of Russia and pay for it for those who are still doing it. And then the sanctions may in fact tighten up so that the U.S. particularly looks like Congress wants to basically outlaw buying anything from Russia, including oil and gas. So this is all leading to soaring agricultural prices. So we are talking about higher inflation than we were before the war started, and that higher inflation means that people have to spend more on the basics of life, meaning that they have less for other expenditures. And so we're really looking at stagflation, which means more inflation than we thought would occur and slower economic growth.
Well, let's talk about inflation and the impact of war on inflation. I want to bring up a chart that was actually in your blog, where looking at sort of history of the wars and the impact on inflation. Right. If history is any guide, what do you think the macroeconomic effects of this conflict will have on inflation here for the United States?
The chart you bring up is something that I've been showing for quite some time, and it shows the level of the CPI, not the year-over-year percent change, but the level of the CPI at an annual basis back to 1800s. And what it clearly shows is that for a very long period of time, major wars were associated with spiking commodity prices, and then peace times were associated with globalization. In other words, national economies would be more integrated through peaceful trade, and that would actually lead to deflation, which is actually very good for most people. To spend less on energy, less on food is a positive for most of us. The reality is, since the end of the Cold War, we've had a tremendous amount of global competition that's kept a lid on inflation. But now this war, it seems to be of significant global impact, that it is causing commodity prices to go up in an environment where post dealing with the pandemic, we saw a tremendous amount of inflationary pressures resulting from very stimulative fiscal and monetary policies. So this is hitting us exactly at the wrong time with regards to inflation. Very reminiscent of the 1970s, when bad luck, bad policy making, and geopolitical issues that drove the price of oil up twice created a tremendous amount of inflation.
Well, I was going to say, this is different than anything we've experienced before because of the pandemic. And inflation, we're talking about it so much now, of course, because of the war, but the truth is that it was gas prices were rising before the Ukraine invasion. Is there anything particular that we should be looking at when we look at that specific situation of coming out of a pandemic and now suddenly going into a potential Europe-wide war?
Well, let's hope it doesn't go there, and let's hope that the nations of the world rise up with sanctions, and that China joins the world in chastising Putin for what he's doing, and that some ceasefire occurs. But short of that, I think the most likely scenario of concern, given what we know today, is that these high commodity prices really do depress global economic growth, and we're not talking about therefore stagflation. We might be talking about a recession, And that would be unfortunate, clearly. But I certainly hope this doesn't get to the level of European-wide war, and that enough support is provided to the Ukrainians that they do what nobody thought could do, and that is David beating Goliath.
Yeah, they're putting up quite a fight. Yeah. Looking here to the United States, on Friday we had some pretty strong job numbers, and of course that was data since pre-invasion. Right. Do you think that this conflict, this war, is going to impact the jobs market here in the United States, or maybe not yet, maybe later, maybe not at all? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's hard to see that it's favorable for the labor market. I think the risk is that maybe there was a lot of hiring that occurred because employers heard that it's very hard to find workers, and so maybe they scrambled and they hoarded workers. And if that's the case, and it turns out that in some areas of the economy there's more workers than were necessary, and suddenly things slow down, then at least we might see a real slowdown in hiring. In any event, the labor market has got its biggest longer-term problem is a shortage of workers from demographic reasons. And so I think wages continue to go up. I think productivity will make a tremendous comeback. I think real wages will improve. I think once we get through this Ukrainian crisis and things geopolitically calm down, I think the outlook for the U.S. labor market is actually still pretty good for workers, shortage of workers with rising wages relative to prices.
And you don't think that the high and rising prices in oil and in other commodities will impact either wage increase or hiring?
Well, right now that's the case. I'm just trying to give you an optimistic scenario coming out of this, but right now you're absolutely right. We're in the midst of some pretty painful developments on a geopolitical front, and it is having an adverse impact on both inflation and on real growth, and it could very well affect the labor market and showing a slowdown, not because the workers aren't there, but because employers decide they want to be more cautious about expanding in a world where the geopolitical uncertainties have suddenly become so fraught with danger.
And I appreciate you being optimistic. Don't let me damper the mood. You did say that you do foresee a potential recession. Explain to me how you think that will happen, or how soon you think that will happen, not just globally, but here in the United States as well.
Well, recessions in the past typically have occurred because the Fed raised interest rates, and as they continue to raise interest rates, there'd be a financial crisis, something would blow up, and that would become an economy-wide credit crunch, so even good borrowers couldn't borrow, and that all would cause a recession. This time around, the Fed hasn't even started raising interest rates. I think it's going to start raising rates at the March 15th, 16th meeting, but I think they're going to be very cautious. I don't see them doing 50 basis points. I think they'll do 25 basis points. They might wait a meeting, and they will rightly attribute their caution to the geopolitical uncertainties unleashed by the Ukrainian crisis. But other than that, I think that the other cause of recessions in the past was spiking oil prices. And I don't know if they actually caused recessions. I mean, but if you look at, for example, the big recession in 2008, everybody attributes it to the housing market. But the reality is the crude oil price actually went up to $150 a barrel. So I think it certainly contributed to the recession back then. I don't know if 150 this time around would actually cause a recession. But a combination of higher oil prices and food prices and ongoing jitters about where this is all leading could cause consumers to cut back, could cause businesses to cut back, and it could add up to a recession. That's not my most likely scenario. Right now, it's just more inflation and less growth, stagflation, not recession.
What effects of this war are you watching most closely, Ed?
Well, it can make your head spin trying to keep up with all this, and there is a lot of disinformation. So trying to get various sources for confirmation, but even so, it's it's hard to assess how things are going. I think it seems as though the resistance of the Ukrainians have been remarkable and heroic, and that there is actually an outside chance that, as I said, David will beat Goliath. But then again, Putin is clearly committing major crimes here and dramatically increasing the aggression which he's going against the Ukrainians, the civilian population. So it may be that negotiations lead to a ceasefire and then some sort of settlement where the Russians get to keep some parts of eastern Ukraine, and that Western Ukraine remains independent, maybe with a neutral government. But I don't think the world wants to see that anymore. I think the world wants to see Ukraine stay intact with the current government, and with Putin basically being forced to stop. And then we have to deal with other issues with regards to human rights violations and crimes committed against Ukrainians. But I'm just watching everything, all the moving parts here, and there's a lot of them.
Yeah, and it's crazy to think that it's only been a bit over a week. It sort of feels it feels longer, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'd like to see the Chinese turn around and really join the rest of the world in at least economically attacking Putin.
Well, we'll have to have you on the show again when that happens, if that happens. Dr. Yardeni, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon again.
Absolutely. Thank you.
That was Ed Yardeni. He is president of Yardeni Research, and you'll want to check out his blog on his LinkedIn page. Fascinating stuff. And thank you for everyone who joined. We didn't get to comments today, but we appreciate you putting them in the stream. You can continue the conversation, or you can check out some of our other stories to the right of your feed. If you're on mobile, click into the search box. I'm Nina Melendez. Thank you so much for watching LinkedIn News Live.